Welcome to Smart Talk, where we speak with leading academics and other thoughtful persons on the important challenges facing the world today. My name is Edward Dodson. I'm a longtime member of the faculty of the Henry George School of Social Science. Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming back to Smart Talk Jack Rasmus, a professor in the economics and politics departments at St. Mary's College in California. Although he served as an economist for several global companies, he also has a long history of involvement in the labor movement. He hosts a weekly radio program each Friday called Alternative Visions on the Progressive Radio Network. His most recent book is titled The Scourge of Neoliberalism, U.S. Economic Policy from Reagan to Bush. This was published in January of 2020. Today, Professor Rasmus will share with us his sense of the state of the U.S. economy and what we can look forward to on critical economic fronts, such as job creation, wage levels, inflation, public debt, and the global financial picture. Professor Rasmus, welcome back to Smart Talk.
Pleasure. Just one correction. My latest book, Scourge of Neoliberalism, is from Reagan to Trump.
Oh.
So it's up to date.
Okay. Sorry for getting that wrong. I think I must have picked it up from something published elsewhere. But anyway, let's start with an issue that I think will resonate with many in Smart Talk's audience. How well the U.S. economy is doing is a pretty personal judgment, I think. For those who have the financial resources to invest in the stock market or in real estate, the economy seems to be doing pretty well, right?
Well, it's a mixed picture.
Okay. Even for those who are well-heeled, it's a mixed picture. At the same time, there are millions of people who remain unemployed or underemployed. So I guess the first thing I'd like to ask you to talk about is, what do you see as the effect of escalating asset price inflation in the financial markets and other aspects to the employment picture on the real economy and on working people?
Well, we can start with the asset markets and then talk about the real economy. They are really two separate pictures. The asset markets, we're talking about stocks and bonds and currencies and derivatives and so forth, are doing quite well. And that's largely, I think, because of the Federal Reserve has been pumping trillions of dollars into the economy, which began in March of 2020. And actually, if you consider what's called the repo market, even before that, $4 trillion about has been pumped into the economy to prevent a financial banking crash that they thought might occur with COVID. The banks weren't really yet in trouble, but it was a preemptive bailout, you might say, which is kind of unique. The first time we ever preemptively bailed out the banks. And when I say banks, I mean not just the commercial banks, JP Morgan and so forth, but I mean the shadow banks, investment banks, equity firms, hedge funds, and even private non-bank corporations. They all got bailed out. This was kind of unique for the first time to have the Fed actually do that broad of a pre-bailout. And that money has continued to flow into the economy, and the financial sector has done quite well ever since. The money flows into stocks and bonds ultimately. So the financial side has not been impacted virtually at all here. A lot of debt has been accumulated, but the cash flow and the liquidity to service that debt has grown as well. So that's the picture on the financial side.
Before we go on, let me ask you a question about that. After the 2008 crash, the Federal Reserve indicated it was going to impose much more rigid stress tests on the financial institutions. From what you've seen and read, are they still adhering to those more rigid stress tests, or have they backed off on it in order to get the institutions to put more money out into the economy?
Well, they've liberalized the stress test ever since Trump came in office. And the stress test originally, you could critique them a little bit. They really only focused, the Fed only focused on the top banks, a dozen or so. And the stress tests were a little bit questionable since they told the banks before the test what they were going to test.
Right.
So it kind of gave the banks an opportunity to move their money around in their accounting around, so it looked like they were doing okay. But the stress tests are a continuation of the 2008-9 crash. They are not as strenuous as they once were, but they really only look at the very top banks, U.S. banks. It's kind of more of a way of warning the banks, be careful, we will watch you. It's not really looking at them rigorously here to prevent the crash. But you should understand that this is not like 2008-9. The banks were not in trouble. Big corporations were not in trouble. They loaded up on cash before 2020 because they knew it was coming. The big corporations took down their loan lines with the banks. They accumulated cash that way. Interest rates were very cheap, so they loaded up on corporate bond borrowing. So when the time came with the CARES Act, which provided for $1.1 trillion of mid-size and large corporate loans from the Fed, they didn't take it. Big corporations, medium-sized corporations didn't need it because it came with some strings, and they could load up on all that cash without having to take the government debt, you see. So corporations, except for those in the areas, like travel and airlines and so forth, hotels, leisure, we're not really in any danger here with this COVID thing and the crash of the economy. The real problem with the crash of the real economy was in the services sectors that had to shut down. And those have been bailed out. But even a company like Boeing, which was eligible for $50 billion, did not take the money from the Fed and the government. They simply raised bonds, issued new bonds for $25 billion, and were able to maintain stability throughout the crisis so far. So you got to understand that this is a crisis that does not affect the financial system yet, and it's a crisis that really has not impacted large corporations, medium-sized corporations yet. It's mostly impacted small businesses and certain sectors, service sectors, and of course, the labor markets, the working class. They're the ones who have taken on the real burden of this COVID Great Recession 2.0, as I call it.
Explain what you mean by that. For example, one observation that I made is as interest rates have fallen to the floor, the savings of many retired individuals in the United States, not necessarily wealthy retired individuals, has fallen dramatically. And their only option is to take risk by converting whatever savings they have into the stock market, because CDs and money market funds are paying almost nothing. So I wonder how you see the overall effect on not just working people, but just middle income people generally.
Yeah, well, most of the savings and the savings rate is enjoyed by the top 10% of the population, maybe even 5%. Yeah, you may have some median income people with some stock in their 401k, but they don't. It's not much, and they don't really transact very much. So when you talk about the savings rate and the amount of savings having gone up, it's mostly for this top tier households. And for the rest, of course, there was a big problem, and that's only deteriorated further with what savings they have in savings accounts and so forth. Well over half of the population has no savings at all to speak of. Less than $400, the statistics show. That was a problem going into this, and of course, this situation has only made it worse for that part of society. And it's part of the breakdown of the retirement system in this country in the last several decades, which has been exacerbated here by the COVID situation.
By that, do you mean the movement away from defined benefit plans to 401ks and like?
Yeah, that's part of it. When in the post-World War II period, the U.S. set up a retirement system that was pretty stable at the time, a three-stool system that they call the three legs of the retirement stool. One was Social Security that was only designed to provide 1/3 of what you needed in retirement.
Right.
Another stool was personal savings. And a third stool was what's called defined benefit retirement plans, which were really pretty good plans, but which only really exist now in the public sector. They've been converted by corporations into what we call 401k plans. 401k plans have really been a bust for most of the population. It doesn't provide has not provided sufficient retirement funds. So you look at two legs of the stool, both the savings rate and the defined benefit plans, they're broken. And the one stool left, of course, is what you may have here with Social Security. And that's why you have so many people who've gone on Social Security early retirement. And it only averages like $1,200–1,400 a month, and that's increased the poverty rate and the homeless rate.
The statistic that I saw with regard to seniors is that 1 out of 4 households headed by a senior live on Social Security benefits alone. They have no savings at all and no pension, and that's pretty scary.
Yeah, that's pretty scary, and it's really a reflection of the fact we haven't had any real wage increases for 4 decades now, at least, real wage increases. That's a result of a lot of high-paying jobs being offshored since the 1980s. And it's also a reflection of the near destruction of the union movement and other forces as well, and the increased indebtedness of households trying to make up for a lack of wage increases. It's a combination of policies which have resulted in the lack of real income gains, except for maybe the top 10% of the working population, the civilian labor force.
It occurs to me listening to you with the three-legged stool analysis, kind of reminds me of what Galbraith wrote, I think, about something like that. He used the analogy of business, labor, and government as being the legs of the stool. So it's the first time I've heard your version of the story. But a fourth leg might be equity in a residential property, and we still have 62% owner occupancy in the United States, although it's declining. I wonder, I haven't looked at the data lately to see how many senior households are relying on reverse mortgages to try to get some additional income. But I suspect that that's one option that some people have if they're living in an area where property values are increasing.
Yeah, there are some households that are fortunate enough to have purchased their home. There's a wealth effect there as the value of their home goes up, but that means that the rest of the households who are renters aren't able to get into the housing market themselves.
Exactly.
They're pretty much locked out now, and the only real mortgage activity going on is for people who have homes, who are refinancing homes. There's some new purchase of homes, but they're high-end mostly. And that means you're leaving a lot of people out, which ultimately ends up in problems of homelessness and rent problems and so forth.
Do you see any signs that either at the state level or community levels that governments are beginning to recognize that they need to increase the supply of affordable housing, for their
Yeah,
residents
there's
and their
some
citizens?
activity going on at a local level. Some cities are trying to provide some affordable housing, but it's really just a trickle, given the size of the problem. There's a realization of the problem, but they can't seem to come up with a broad general solution to it in terms of national policy.
Kind of related issue for families and working families that seems to be not discussed is or at least it has been discussed in the campaign, but so far it doesn't seem to be discussed on a regular basis, is what we're going to do about student loan debt. And the data that I've looked at has a surprising statistic that a lot of this debt is being carried by older people, not just senior citizens, but parents and grandparents who are taking on responsibility for student debt for their younger members of their family, their children and grandchildren.
Yeah, the student debt issue is really a critical issue here. What is it, 1.5 trillion or something like that? A huge amount, and it's holding back consumption of people who are carrying that debt, and playing a role in their inability to get into the housing market themselves. There's a big forbearance that's been going on in payment of student debt since this COVID thing began. And what you got is a backlog of hundreds of billions of dollars of owed backlogged debt payments here. I don't see how they're gonna pay that. And once the forbearance ends here in January next year, how is that going to be restructured in terms of their debt? Is it going to raise the amount they're going to have to pay, or are they just going to tack it on at the end of their loan, which means it'll go longer? It's unknown how they're going to carry the repayment of that debt load. The same thing with the rental market forbearance going on. I saw statistics at the end of 2020 that $70 billion in backlogged rent would have to be paid somehow. I don't know how that's going to be repaid by those folks, especially once they're evicted. But you can contrast that 70 billion owned for 7 to 11 million renters out there. There's about 48 million rental units in the U.S. and maybe 70 some million renters. About 11 million are caught in this backlog rent, forbeared rent. How they're going to pay for it is going to be interesting. I don't know how that will actually occur, but we'll have to just see how they do it. But you may contrast that with the 120 billion a month that in virtual free money that the Federal Reserve is giving banks that don't really need it right now. 120 billion a month. It's been about $4 trillion since the crisis began. The Fed is saying we're going to continue the 120 billion at least for another 18 months, although that may change. 120 billion a month to sources that don't need it, compared to 70 billion or so for renters who desperately need it. It just shows you the lopsided priorities going on right now in this economy.
That seems to be in part an ideological struggle over the balance between property rights and human rights. I mean, it would seem that in our wealthy society, that access to decent housing should be right up on the top of the rights of being a member of our society, and it's really tragic that our government has not met the challenge. I don't begrudge landlords, property owners, for earning a profit on their assets, but it seems that the supply-demand ratio has been out of kilter for a long time, and the private sector just doesn't build affordable housing unless it's mandated to do so by such measures as inclusionary zoning or other kind of restrictive covenants. But there's a lot of NIMBYism in our communities. People don't want affordable housing in their backyard, and it's remarkable in the sense that many people who live in a nice community, their children who are adults and working cannot afford to live close. And so we get the side effect of sprawling development around all of our cities, because empty farmland is the only place to build reasonably affordable housing. And what do? We add to the number of automobiles on the roads at all hours of the day and sprawl. And all of that contributes to the next sort of subject I wanted to talk to you about, and that is externalities. Economists use the term externalities to refer to factors that change expected outcomes from those that are predicted by economic models. And among the most challenging, it seems to me, are the destructive effects of climate change, as well as the global spread of COVID-19's pandemic, which raises the question, really, do the world's societies have the financial capacity and the resources to meet these externalities head on? And is there any expectation of success when everything we've talked about so far has raised enormous challenges for the public sector to find the funds, to find the resources?
Well, I think the societies do have the resources. It's just a question of reallocating them from where they are allocated now. And there's trillions and trillions of dollars just in the US alone sitting on the sideline right now. But they flow in and out of the financial markets mostly. Just look at the Fortune 500 companies since the 2008-9 crash. They've been providing their shareholders around on average $1 trillion a year in stock buybacks and dividend payouts. $1 trillion. And that's only the top tier of the large corporations. Under Obama, it was like $800 billion a year in buybacks and dividend payouts. Under Trump, it was 1.3 trillion a year until COVID in 2020. But I predict that will accelerate back up to $1 trillion plus per year. And that's only the top layer of corporate America. There's a lot of liquid assets out there. But to get those assets redirected, you would have to change the tax system. Now, Biden has, during his run for election, has indicated how he might do that to reallocate money to climate change and other needs. But so far, he hasn't been able to do that. You could see that in the infrastructure bill negotiations and the backtracking on corporate taxes. And you'll see that continually here on the new negotiations going on human infrastructure, where Biden has promised to raise taxes on folks making over $400,000 a year and on corporations. But he will backtrack on that, I predict, as well, if he wants to get anything passed, because there are strong lobbying interests in Congress that simply don't want to raise the Trump tax cuts. You see, the Trump tax cuts amounted to $4 trillion. They've been reporting it as $1.5 trillion, but people don't realize that $1.5 trillion was predicated on economic growth of 3.5% in GDP every year for 10 years, the next 10 years after the 2007 when the tax cuts were passed. And of course, we haven't had 3.5% in just the first year after that. No rule we have 3.5% for the next 8 years either. So that's how you got to the 1.5%. It's called dynamic scoring in Congress. You cut taxes, but you say it's going to stimulate the economy so much that it's going to generate more tax revenues coming in to offset the tax cuts. Well, that's nice in theory, but it doesn't work that way. And
it goes back to what Art Laffer was arguing back in the 80s, right?
Yeah, but that's how they sell it, you see.
Yes.
Also, the Trump tax cuts really ignored the tax cuts for multinational corporations' offshore income gains. They didn't count a lot of that tax cut. That's why the tax cut was really 4 trillion and not 1.5 trillion. And what all of these fiscal policies of Biden are predicated on is the ability to pay for it by raising or taking back some of these massive tax cuts. But so far, that hasn't been possible because there are interests in Congress that simply do not want to take back the Trump tax cuts. And by the way, that's on the Democrats party side as well as the Republican side. So you have this coalition that's not in favor of taking back some of those tax cuts. And therefore, you don't have a way of really financing the fiscal spending proposals. Now, they cobbled together with the infrastructure bill a series of smoke and mirrors, non-tax hikes to pay for the 1.1 trillion. On its face, it's really only 550 billion. But the only reason they got a consensus and got that through was that they did not raise taxes. They did not reverse the Trump tax cuts. They cobbled together little pieces here and there, some of them with smoke and mirrors, I would say, in order to pay for the infrastructure bill. I don't think they have enough anywhere else to pay for the $3.5 trillion human infrastructure Sanders plan, whatever you want to talk about, which includes climate change, which includes elderly assistance, free college tuition, and other
the whole agenda of social welfare benefits.
Social welfare benefits, right? That you won't see. I don't think you'll see that pass unless Nancy Pelosi wants to cut it back dramatically, and I mean by trillions. And if she does that, then you might get a passage of a minimalist bill before the end of the year. But of course, Mitch McConnell is not in favor of that at all. As far as he's concerned, it's done. It's a done deal. And actually, McConnell has 52 votes if you count Sinema, Kristen Sinema, and Joe Manchin. He's got who are opposed to this.
Yeah,
they've got enough to stop any further spending on social programs, human infrastructure, climate change, whatever. So that's the big dilemma, policy dilemma. But you got to understand that Trump tax cuts are tied in with the fiscal spending, because if you can't raise the taxes, you can't do the spending. So you conversely reduce the spending so you don't have to raise the taxes. You see, that's what's going on in these policy fights in Congress right now.
Or you have to be willing to accept the supply side argument that lower marginal tax rates will generate more federal revenue over time.
Which is a fiction.
Right. It has been a fiction.
Yeah.
Another aspect to this, I wonder if you've thought about or have a comment in, is the international aspect. When you have so many multinational corporations that are operating in many different countries, each of those countries competing for that business by providing, tax breaks and tax incentives. And there seems to be now at least an interest in some sort of international treaty that will equalize the tax obligations to multinational corporations. Do you see the United States, given our political environment right now, as being willing to accept that?
Well, that's a work in progress. And Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, and Biden have been able to get the Europeans and some others to agree to a 15% minimum alternative tax. Okay. Actually, in Europe, they're paying less than 15% already. So it's kind of trying to get those corporations who are virtually paying no taxes at all to pay some taxes. Some corporations are paying more than that, but when you look at the tech companies, finance bank companies, pharmaceutical companies and some other industries, they aren't paying taxes virtually at all. And they're global multinational corporations. So that move in which the U.S. is taking the lead and Europe is on board, and there are some other countries coming on board, is designed to have these global companies who are very good at avoiding taxes by intra-company pricing, moving their money around on paper, and minimizing their taxes in the U.S. and globally, to get them to pay something. But as I said, it's a work in progress, and it probably will take several years before you conclude this, and that's probably too late.
Well, certainly, I'm thinking as you're talking about the experience that Ireland had of being the Celtic tiger for a while and having it implode on them, and it seems to have totally backfired. That the low taxes that they imposed on companies that domiciled in Ireland had the effect of driving up the cost of living for most Irish people. And now Ireland is struggling, it seems, to try to find a way back. And from what I read, with now the problem of the UK pulling out of the European Union, it seems like they're in a desperate situation in the Irish Republic.
Yeah, well, they're one of the holdouts for this 15% alternative minimum tax. And there's a couple other countries in Europe as well, because, as you say, they've been reaping the benefits of being the biggest tax cut haven. A lot of companies not only don't move their actual operations to Ireland and these places, but they do what's called an inversion. An inversion is you move your corporate headquarters to this virtual low tax, no tax environment, and you claim massive tax cuts for your operations, which may be elsewhere in a higher tax. That's called a corporate inversion. Pharmaceutical companies and tech companies love to do that. They're some of the biggest tax avoiders. It's legal, and I don't see anything in the Biden administration really wanting to change that. Big lobbying interests don't want to change that.
Well, certainly the president is from the state of Delaware, and the state of Delaware has one of the most advantageous corporate tax structures that has been in place for many, many decades.
True.
So I doubt if his administration is going to do anything to change that. I once read that 1 out of 4 state dollars that comes into the state of Delaware comes from those corporations that have their headquarters recorded in one building in Wilmington, Delaware, which is a lot of reason to keep the system in place.
A very strong vested interest to not want to change the tax system. But that's part of the big problem. To get back to the original question, there's trillions and trillions of dollars on the sidelines moving in and out of financial markets that could be used to help finance the real economy, to help finance climate change and some of these severe social inequities that we see in the U.S., not just in housing, but in other areas as well.
With regard to climate change, one of the most serious problems, it seems globally, but certainly in the United States, is the combination of rising temperatures, drought, and fires. And I wonder how this is going to affect the insurance sector of the economy with all the claims that are being filed. Do you think that we're up for perhaps a bailout of the insurance companies because of the costs of dealing with these environmental disasters?
Well, a good example is here in California, where we have these massive fires now for 3 years in a row, and it looks like this is going to continue for some time. And of course, a lot of claims on insurance companies. But the insurance companies have pretty much distributed the burden across the rest of their customer base. In other words, making their customer base pay for it pretty much. Home insurance rates, even for people who are not in the danger zones in California, have doubled in the last 12, 15 months, virtually doubled. And
So
they're going to buy some more. So
they're not necessarily pricing for real risk. They're pricing for average risk.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And the same you could say for utilities like PG&E, which has been responsible for some of these fires. The power lines have not been really secured, and it's been proven they've precipitated some of these fires. They're doing the same. They're distributing the cost, large part of their cost, in order to not have to put the burden on the shareholders, you see. That's what's coming out of the state governments, protecting these companies to some extent, by allowing them to distribute the burden of the cost of this. But you can't go on that way forever. The households cannot carry the insurance and the utility burden too much longer, I don't think. So there's going to have to be a national policy, I think, to deal with disaster insurance. But right now, that's not forthcoming.
Yeah, as I look at the news every day, it's just a scary proposition of how much infrastructure is being destroyed by all of this at the same time as we're fighting over trying to get money to repair what infrastructure still exists. It sort of leads me into a bit of the discussion about monetary policy and the advocates of simply asking the government to print more money in order to respond to the increasing demands and needs for it. Is that, in your mind, a formula for potential hyperinflation?
Well, I'm not a big advocate of the classical argument that inflation is due to too much money chasing too few goods. That comes out of classical economics, just to be a little bit academic about it here, of the 18th and 19th century, that believed that money was neutral as far as stimulating the real economy is concerned. It was called the neutrality proposition. In other words, money would only excess money would only result in inflation, stimulating inflation. It couldn't really generate the real economy. The real economy was generated by real factors of production, land, labor, capital, and you needed just enough money to accommodate those real factors. And if you put more money than was necessary, that would cause inflation. I don't believe there's a single cause of inflation, and I don't believe it's a monetary cause, although it's still very popular in academia and some corners here. Inflation is really a result of real factors, I think, not just monetary factors. I'm not a big advocate of monetary causes of inflation. On the other hand, what you do see is a monetary excess money playing a role in causing financial asset bubbles. Not the real economy, but the financial asset side of it. Ever since we abandoned Bretton Woods in the 1970s, and we left it up to central banks, Federal Reserve and other central banks, to regulate the money supply as they wished. What we've got, particularly in the US since the mid-1980s, is this constant injection of excessive liquidity, money, by the central banks into the economy. And that has built up. They inject it, but they don't take it back. You see, it's very hard to take it back. The money gets out there. It has a multiplier effect. And most of it, I believe, in the 21st century is going into financial asset markets. It's being diverted into financial assets. And that's why these financial asset markets, stocks, bonds, derivatives, and so forth, are booming. And they don't seem to correct except very temporarily, and then they bounce right back. It's really the Fed, fundamentally the Fed's problem that's causing this. And it's destabilizing the economy, because what it does is give a signal that bigger profits are to be made in financial asset markets than in the real economy. So let's put our excess capital into financial assets rather than into stimulating the real economy. Now we do have the real economy growing still in certain sectors. I'm not saying that it's all financial asset diversion going on, but we have the two forces that are contending with each other: financial asset investment and real investment. I talked about this in great detail in my 2017 book, Systemic Fragility in the Global Economy, and predicted that this trend would continue to go on. And of course, it's fed by the Fed, no pun intended, but also it's fed by the tax system. You keep cutting taxes on corporations and investors, so corporates are able to distribute $1 trillion a year, as I talked about before, to their shareholders. Where do the shareholders then redirect that largesse? Well, wherever they get the best profits, and that's in the financial sector. So we have this long-term secular trend of the diversion of money capital going into financial assets, in a sense, crowding out, to some extent, the real economy, real asset investment. And it's real asset investment that creates the jobs, that creates the income for folks and for businesses, and creates the tax base, because we don't tax financial transactions, you see. If we did, then we would solve our tax revenue problem here of financing all these new initiatives that we need, be it climate change, be it housing, or whatever.
Yeah, there have been any number of proposals to put a fee on every financial transaction, but in your view, is the structure of our capital gains tax, is that a contributing problem? Because it seems to reward gains from rent seeking and speculation over income earned by producing goods and services. From a standpoint of someone who studied Henry George's ideas about tax policy, it seems like what we need to do is get away from taxing earned income flows and begin to tax income that's gained by not producing anything, by the speculation that you've just talked about. Why not lump all income into one report when you file for your taxes, forget where the income came from, and just apply maybe an exemption for some level of individual income, maybe the national median or something even higher, and then do away with all the other deductions, exemptions, and apply a progressive rate of taxation on everything. It would, people like Malcolm Forbes were always arguing for tax simplification, but he wanted a flat rate tax. And I think you and I would agree that that would not be just or even economically beneficial.
Well, business and policymakers did not adopt the 15% flat tax that Forbes proposed because large corporations don't pay 15%, you see. On average, they pay somewhere around 8 to 12%. On average, and many.
Well, I'm only thinking about individuals as opposed to businesses. Although, I think it's up to six states now impose a graduated rate of taxation on gross revenue on businesses. I don't know the details, but that also seems to me to be a a better way to capture unearned revenue, or at least capture revenue gained by the large corporate entities. If we really think that job creation comes for small businesses, why don't we reward small businesses and give them the tax breaks and capture more of the tax revenue we need from these large entities that benefit by all these rent-seeking privileges they have?
Yeah, well, when Trump was running for president, he immediately came out with a pledge that he would cut corporate investor taxes by $5 trillion. This was, I think, in February or March of 2016. He proposed that, and at that time, I wrote an article that indicated how much you could get from minimal financial transaction taxes. In other words, a dollar per 1,000 on bond trades. I think it was 10% or something like that on stock trades over $10,000, and just a couple pennies on transactions buying and selling the $4 trillion a day in currencies. Okay. And that would raise $200-300 billion. I mean, that minimal amount of taxation would not discourage the transactions. It's so minimal, but the amounts are so vast that you could bring in a lot of money without really discouraging the actual transactions. But no one wants to go there. No one wants to touch financial transactions because the lobbying interests are so strong in that regard, and they don't want a foot in the door. They don't want anybody to establish the precedent that you can tax financial transactions. But that's how eventually we have to go if you want to really raise the money to pay for what's needed in the real economy, and also to put a bit of a damper on this accelerating trend in the 21st century of money capital flowing into financial asset investment, which is now massive because the financial asset markets are really global, and many new financial asset securities have been created, and the markets to trade these, some people call these derivatives, are global now, and they are linked instantaneously with the new technology, so that there's a layer of investors. I call them the new finance capital elite, global investors, maybe 250,000 of them globally, who are really reaping the benefits of these global financial asset markets and this boom in financial asset investing going on. And that's a problem, I think. And they are deeply embedded in the political systems of Europe, US, and Japan. The investment banks, the private equity firms, the hedge funds, and so forth are their institutions. But behind the institutions are the agents, these very, very wealthy investors investing individually or through these institutions that are largely unregulated. You see, we've got the commercial banks regulated to some extent, but what we call the shadow banks are virtually still unregulated. And that's where the very rich and the money capital has been flowing. It's not by accident, I believe, under the Trump that you get two big shadow bankers, Steve Mnuchin and Gary Cohn, running the economic policies of Trump. And by the way, those are the two individuals who wrote the 2017 Trump tax cuts. They did it behind closed doors, didn't really go through the committees, and they rammed it through in December 2017 through Congress. Mitch McConnell and Republicans controlled both houses. They rammed it through. There was very little discussion of it, and it wasn't even budget reconciliation. They didn't need that. So that's how we got this $4 trillion tax cut. But why are investment bankers and others really running the economic policy of this country is an interesting question. And you can see it in other markets as well. The shadow banks have penetrated the repo market and pretty much running the repo market now. This is a problem, I think, of the new finance elite economically getting their way to keep their game going, both economically and politically. And until we do something about that to check that trend, we're going to continue having some of the tax and financing problems for the real economy. And we can see it right now. The infrastructure bill was pared down from 2.3 to $550 billion, 2.3 trillion to $550 billion in order to get it passed. And of course, the 3.5 trillion human spending bill is, I think it's dead on arrival. It's DOA. It'll never get through Congress. This is a problem because this kind of expenditure needs to occur, and it's not.
I know neither one of us can predict what's going to happen in the midterm election, but it seems to me, listening to you, that is going to be an extremely important point in the politics of the United States that dictates the economic outcomes of the next any number of years. The question is, are there enough voters in the United States who have any sense of the issues that you've raised in our conversation that will cause them to vote in their own real interests, as opposed to listening to the rhetoric that's coming out of political candidates, and what we can expect at the voting booth? It seems to me we could have this conversation after those elections, and you would have a really good idea of how good or bad the near future is going to be for us.
Well, it's hard to know exactly where the country's going in 2022, but I would go out on a limb and predict that the Democrats are going to lose the House. It's already very, very narrow, and typically, in an off election, the party in power loses seats. I think there's only like 5 or 6 seats difference between the two. And I'm not very optimistic that they'll hold on to the House. Will they hold on to the Senate? Well, there's more Republicans up for election than Democrats. That one is a little harder to call. But most of the Americans you're talking about don't make that kind of rational decision. What's in their interest? They make decisions. Too many of them make decisions based upon what the blogosphere tells them. And this alternative fact universe out there is very dangerous, very dangerous. And of course, that's a product, I think, of technology run amok, and clever politicians manipulating it. That's a problem in the political system that we have going forward, and it's not going to go away.
Well, let me raise a related issue. I mean, you have a long history of involvement with the labor movement. You were president of a labor union at one point in time. Is labor beginning to wake up to their true interests? And are working people beginning to return to the idea that they ought to support labor unions as a competing force between big business and big government?
Well, a lot of polls show that a majority of workers who aren't in unions want unions. It's a clear majority. So in a sense, you might say that workers have awakened, but the leadership is pretty timid and doesn't want to take risks in too many risks. I think that's because the union movement, as it weakened and declined over the years, which is very significant, it's tied itself closer to the Democratic Party, and it always had been, but even closer now. And I don't think they want to stir the sleeping giant of the workers, because it would embarrass the Democrats. They would have to then respond, and that it would be difficult for them to do so. So is there a renaissance around the corner? I don't know. It's a mixed picture. The destruction of the unions since the 1970s has been pretty severe due to a lot of factors, shipping jobs offshore, opening up the open shop in more and more states, a lot of factors that, maybe someday I'll write about. Yes, in my younger years, for 15 years, I was the head of a local union in the communications sector. And then I spent 20 years working for multinational corporations doing market research and analysis, some global companies, tech companies mostly. So I've been able to get a view from both sides of the table, you might say, of what the problem is. But very clearly, the destruction of the unions has been a big factor in preventing wage increases and wages being able to keep up in real terms with what's going on, in inflation and the economy in general. We see certain sectors of workers erupt in protests and demands, but it's not really being led by the union movement. They're kind of way behind the curve, I would say, in many ways right now.
And that sort of brings us full circle. I mean, we've talked about the state of the economy. We've talked about the challenges, not just of our economic system, but the political implications of democracy, and also the environment. If you had one message to give to our listeners today about hope for the future, what would you point to, to give people a sense of optimism that we have a chance of dealing with all these challenges and coming out at the other end with a better society?
Well, I think the general population really understands the problems. I really do. Now, there's a large sector that lives in this alternative fact universe that has
Right.
no idea, and they're being easily manipulated. That's a problem, as I've said. But the majority of Americans, I think, kind of know what the problems are. There's a disjoint between what the public wants and public opinion and what their elected representatives are delivering for them. The problem is, at the institutional level, the system level, rather than at the public level. I think people want something to be done about climate change, significantly. You can see that in the polls. They want unions. They want housing, better housing. They want a more democratic system. Which that's another fight going on right now, because that's tied into what the policies will be. They want education. They want a better life for their kids. So that's the most optimistic thing, I think. It's there. The change is there at the grassroots. The problem is the change does not get translated into policy. And that's probably a problem of lobbying and Citizens United and buying of campaigns and so forth, and the drift to the right in the Supreme Court, and voter suppression going on at the state level, and the gerrymandering that's been occurring for decades now, so that you only have 40, 50 seats in the House that are ever really contended. This is part of the ossification of the political system, so that it allows minorities with money to really dominate the political system, which blocks the public and what they want from getting through and having their institutions deliver for them. You see, there's no lack of desire for change and understanding of the need for change. It's that we've got these obstacles built into now the political institutions that they don't really reflect what the people really want to have done. Special interests are able to block it because the Supreme Court, to be frank, has enabled a lot of this with their decisions on money as free speech and on their decisions of supporting gerrymandering and on their decisions of recently supporting the various red states to engage in voter suppression, and declaring certain acts and laws unconstitutional. Most recently, the evictions extension, saying that's unconstitutional. People should realize the Supreme Court does not have, per the Constitution, the right to declare anything unconstitutional. It's not in the Constitution that the Supreme Court is an co-equal branch of government. It's not there.
It was just created as by John Marshall.
Yeah, John Marshall, who by the way was Secretary of State for John Adams, who represented business interests, and he was appointed Chief Supreme Court when Jefferson won the election as a way to hold back and thwart the Jeffersonian Democratic Revolution that Jefferson wanted to impose. So you've got wealthy interests who established a beachhead within the effort to democratize the U.S. government even further, and that beachhead has only grown ever since. It was in the late 1870s where after the Civil War, where the Supreme Court really started playing this role of declaring laws unconstitutional and declaring that corporations were persons and therefore had all the rights of persons, which is the basis for Citizens United. You see, if they're persons, then spending money is free speech. So, especially in recent decades, I've got to, point a finger at the Supreme Court and its drift, not in ensuring the expansion of democracy, but in holding back that expansion. And then, of course, we have the problem of the red states. Because of gerrymandering, the Republicans have been able to control the red states and therefore the legislatures and therefore the electoral college and therefore pass voter suppression bills. It's a kind of a nasty coalition of forces that have been able to ossify the government to prevent it from really responding to the demands of the majority of the public for more democracy and therefore for passing a lot of this legislation and policies that really need to happen. And we're kind of running out of time, I think, particularly with the climate change problem and issue, but other problems as well within the country. We're running out of time. And the big test was going to be whether Biden could, notwithstanding this institutional problem we have, actually bring about the policies to change this drift and direction. So far, although the jury is still out on this, I don't think Biden is going to be able to reverse the broader trend that we see. I hope he does, but I'm not too optimistic looking at what's happened here with the bill here for infrastructure and what I believe will happen with the human infrastructure bill and what's going on in the Federal Reserve. I'm not. I was cautiously optimistic, but I'm increasingly less so.
Well, what you have given us and the listeners to this program is an agenda for those who have an activist bent of many of the issues that they ought to be thinking about and working on as they look at what changes are needed in our society. And certainly this kind of a discussion goes on all the time at the Henry George School of Social Science in the classes that I teach and that others teach. And we're hoping that we're reaching people and giving them a sense that while it's going to be difficult. We have to work very hard if we're going to actually preserve the extent to which democracy still exists. Historians keep telling us this is a noble experiment, and we're still in the middle of the experiment from the standpoint of trying to bring together people from every part of the world with every different set of societal norms, different religions, different languages, different cultures, to live together under one system of law and to guarantee rights to everyone, liberties to everyone, and make it work. You've set the agenda of what we need to be thinking about. I really find that to be the essential message of what's come out of this conversation with you. So I hope it reaches an audience that keeps growing, that people will find your books and read them and pay attention to what you're telling everyone on Counterpunch and on your radio program. So Dr. Rasmus, I really enjoyed our conversation. I thank you for spending the time with me, and we'll have to plan to do this again soon and talk a little bit more specific about what some of the systemic reforms are that we think might work if we can just bring about their adoption.
Yeah, I would just add, if people want to follow what I'm writing about, of course, my website, but my blog is jackrasmus.com. I write articles there weekly, and then I comment on daily developments in the economy on Twitter at drjackrasmus. So if you want to follow me, you can do it there. But I would also conclude with the conversation with the words there of Benjamin Franklin. You know, when he came out of the Constitutional Convention, they asked him, "What do we got?" And he said, "A republic, if you can keep it."
Yeah.
I would add a democratic republic if you can keep it.
Yeah.
You know, I focus on policy. So I have a foot in the economics and a foot in the political side, because, you know, policy has to do with both here. And we've got a crisis both on the political side that needs to be addressed, of democracy, and it's atrophying. And we have a crisis on the economic side of not enough real investment going into the real economy on an equitable basis. And of course, we've got a crisis on the health side with COVID, which is not going away. This may be the new normal. We don't know yet, but this is a big problem. This is what I call the triple crisis. All these three elements are related to each other, and they continue to exacerbate each other, and you need to address all of them at the same time. If COVID weren't here, we would still have a lot of the problems we have. COVID has only exacerbated these problems, economic and political. And of course, the feedback goes the other way in the other directions as well. So how are we going to deal with America's triple crisis is the key question going forward.
Well, hopefully the challenges of dealing with the pandemic and the global warming crisis will begin to get people all around the world and our leaders in government to really finally come to terms with the fact that this planet is all we have, and we need to work together if we're going to sustain its usefulness to us. If we destroy this planet, where are we going to go? Mars does not seem to be open for business yet. And so, well, again, thank you so much. Great talking to you, and I hope that our audience will continue to listen to you. So that's it for this edition of Smart Talk. For more information on this and other episodes, please visit our website, henrygeorgeschool.org. I'm Edward Dodson, and I thank you for watching Smart Talk, everyone.